But their influence started in this political position that they held, which has become, very, very influential as a position by the late 14th century. One final official I want to mention just briefly is an official called the podesta. The podesta is basically the army commander, the commander of the Florentine militia or army. Now, the nature of the Florentine army changed over the years. At some points, it was a mercenary army hired, professional soldiers hired from all around, men called condottieri. Other times, it was a militia, and you might recall that Machiavelli in The Prince argues for the virtues of militia over other forms of government. The podesta is the commander of this military force. The odd thing about him is he's always chosen from outside the city. He's never a native Florentine. They go out to some other city, usually some city really close by, and they hire somebody from there to come in as army commander. Well, why do they do it this way? Why would such an important position be always restricted to non-Florentines, non-citizens of the city? It seems kind of odd at first when you think about it, but the reason was that the Florentines didn't want to let anybody, any Florentine family, have this kind of military power. Because with this kind of military power, you could take over and control the town. And families were always feuding, always disputing, there were always arguments, and they didn't want to put this kind of power in the hands of any family who might use it against other families, or any particular local man who might use it to increase his own power and become a dictator. Now, as you're going to see in the next lecture, there was a tremendous fear of dictators in Florence, and one of the reasons why the Florentine government evolved as such a broad, really participatory government from contemporary standards was the fear of a dictator taking over. And this fear was very real because in the early mid-14th century, as you'll learn in the next lecture, there were episodes where dictators did take over and created serious problems for the city. So the government's designed to move away from that, to spread power out, especially in the case of the podesta. But just think, there are 9 priors, 9 mayors, all these different officials. I mean, power is really diffused, really spread out, and no one really has enough to walk in and take over. Also, another factor which prevented people from accumulating too much power in this governmental structure is that their office terms were so short. 2 months, 3 months, maybe 6 months, then they're out. They're not immediately eligible to be re-elected, so they can't become ensconced, and develop a power base. All these things were developed to spread out power. So, in a sense, it was a practical situation. It was a practical guard against any kind of tyrannical government. But another result of this kind of government was that Florence developed into a very, very political society. And really, it has a relatively broad participation of the citizenry in government. For example, in any one year, about 1,165 different people would serve in some government office. And for the time, that was a broad participation. So there were a large number of politically active citizens in Florence. Because of this large number of politically active citizens, a number of other conditions were fostered. For example, civic pride. There was a tremendous amount of civic pride in Florence, people proud of being Florentine. This was promoted in part by civic humanism, which you'll recall compared Florence to Rome and the Roman Empire and said over and over again, we can be great like Rome, we can attain Roman virtues, and we can be just like the Romans were, powerful. And this fostered real patriotism in the city, and that's one of the things that civic humanism was supposed to do. Another condition that the government fostered was political thinking. So many people were in government and had to make governmental decisions that the average citizen was used to thinking about politics. Political thinking was considered important. It was something that people did on a regular basis, and that was very, very different from, the typical subject of a king in medieval Europe, who never thought about politics and never talked about politics, wouldn't even know what politics was. I mean, there virtually was no politics in monarchies. But in a situation like this, there's a lot of political thinking. Another thing that it fosters is a stress on rhetoric. And you'll recall that rhetoric is one of the bases of humanist education. The humanists believed that you had to be able to communicate your ideas effectively, both to be a good citizen and participate in politics, but also you had to be able to communicate your ideas effectively to motivate and inspire people, in particular to motivate people to make good moral decisions, lead good moral lives. So there's a tremendous stress on communication, on rhetoric, on good public speaking, and this is in fact dictated in part by the fact that the Florentine government is such a broad government, and so many people take part in it, and you really need to be able to communicate ideas back and forth in a situation like this. Finally, the governmental situation fostered all sorts of debate and discussion of problems that you wouldn't find in many other places. You certainly wouldn't find in monarchies in medieval Europe debate about the best kinds of governments, the best kinds of armies, the best kind of person to serve in government. All sorts of political problems were discussed. And the discussions often became quite heated. Sometimes there'd actually be disputes and sometimes even physical confrontations over political issues among the various different people involved. So they took it very seriously, and they debated political ideas in a very serious way. And that makes Florence very different from other places in medieval Europe. So all these conditions that I just talked about that the government fostered, civic pride, political thinking, stress on rhetoric or communication, the frequent debate and discussion of political problems, all these created the need in Florence for an effective system of political and civic education. And this is a very important point, because here you see the governmental structure is actually giving rise to the creation of an educational system. And this, of course, this system of political and civic education was civic humanism, developed by Salutati and Bruni, the two great humanist chancellors. It was designed to create people who could be good citizens, good leaders, good office holders. And it was, of course, as we know, a civic education drawn from reading the Greek and Roman classics, especially histories like Livy, and political thinkers, social thinkers like Cicero were very important in this educational process. So the governmental structure of Florence really has a big role in giving rise to civic humanism by creating the need for an effective civic and political education. We saw this, in the Florentine crisis of 1400, when the Milanese almost conquered Florence, and Salutati and Bruni sit back and say, why did we almost get conquered? Well, because we don't educate our citizens very well. We need a more effective way to educate citizens and create leaders and office holders and governors for the city. So we can see how that works. So in many ways, the Florentine government helps give rise to conditions that foster the Renaissance. And you might even say, create the Renaissance. So in this case, you can see actual factors in Florence effective in creating a new cultural milieu. But it's important to realize that the broad nature of this government did not evolve because of civic humanism. It evolved because of the fear of dictators, the desire to spread out power, the desire to keep families apart, feuding families apart and not gaining too much power. And this, out of these conditions grew the need for political education, and that's what really created civic humanism and helped create the Renaissance. So it's a broad government, and we see exactly what all that led to. Now just a little bit, finally, about the social structure of Florence. Unlike most other medieval societies or earlier medieval societies, there was no such thing as nobles in Florence. There were no nobles in Florence, for reasons you'll see in just a second. Social status in Florence was not determined by whether or not you were of noble lineage. Well, why were there no nobles in Florence, and in fact, no nobles in most of the Italian cities? The reason for that goes back to the Middle Ages. In the earlier Middle Ages, there had been nobles in Florence. They had estates out in the countryside, they had townhouses inside the city, and they would commute back and forth, back and forth. However, the nobles were only one group of people in the city. The other big group, of course, was the commercial middle class. And these two groups of people did not get along. The commercial middle class, the guilds people, they had their own outlook, their own agendas. They were concerned with commerce, the accumulation of wealth. They needed a legal structure and a governmental structure to the city which would promote commerce and promote their business activities. And that's what they were totally focused on. The nobles, on the other hand, cared nothing about commerce. They cared nothing about the middle class accumulating wealth or industry and trade prospering, had no care about that at all. Their main concern was for their own wealth and power. And they believed that they should be the ruling class in town, even though in many cases there were more middle class than there were nobles. The middle class was wealthier than the nobles. The nobles still thought they should be the ones in control. This led to tremendous tension. Another thing that led to tremendous tension was that nobles legally had the right to feud, and legally at least, other middle class and lower families did not have the right to feud. And this is what nobles did in the Middle Ages in the Italian towns most of the time. They feuded with each other. The different families of nobles, they would hire huge groups of retainers, basically toughs, bodyguards with the livery of the noble on front and carrying weapons. And they would go back and forth through the town fighting each other. They would bull right into a city market in the middle of a business day and have a sword fight and tear things up and really create havoc all through the city. And in their townhouses, their city houses, they built these tremendous towers way up so they could go up in the towers and throw stuff off at each other. And you can still see some of these towers when you go to Italian towns today, especially San Gimignano near Pisa, you can see these towers. Of course, they're up there throwing stuff over at each other, and anybody walking beneath, meaning the middle class people, they're getting hit with all this stuff. So it all came to a head in the 1280s, and in the 1280s in Florence and around that time in other cities, the nobles were first excluded from the guilds. They could not be a member of any guild. Then they were excluded from government. They could not hold government office. And then they were kicked out. Many left voluntarily, but others had to be forcibly kicked out. After that, you got no nobles. After that, the ruling class in Florence and other Italian towns were simply the wealthy upper guildsmen, and they took the name of patricians. Patrician simply being the ancient Roman designation for a rich person. So the rich people, the patrician families, they control things. They intermarry. Mobility into their class is possible but slow. You got to have several generations of wealth, not just one, to move up and become a patrician. They control the great guilds. They hold the government offices. They pretty much run the town. And it's not easy to move up into this group at all. Of course, the greatest of all these patrician families was the Medici. Cosimo de' Medici, the first, the patron of this whole family, rich from the wool and banking industry, ruled Florence from behind the scenes from 1430 to 1464. His family, when he took power, or sort of assumed power, had 4 generations of wealth in the Cambio, or Bankers Guild. So the Medici were a perfect example, but there are many other patrician families who played a role in government, as we'll see in the next lecture. The Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Pitti, many others. You can still see their palaces in Florence today. And, this was a very interesting class of people who controlled Florence's culture and politics.